Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4:01 on the East Coast, and so I am going to start. A pleasant good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this installment in the Lusk Perspectives combined with Price Talk series on COVID and the economy, COVID real estate, COVID and other things as well. My name is Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and it's a special treat to introduce our guest today, Claudia Sahm. As many of you know, I spent a year working in Washington, and during the course of that year, I got to work with Claudia, seeing her at least every 2 weeks, a little more often than that, I think. Well, she was detailed to the Council of Economic Advisors, where she was on the senior staff there, which was a period between her being at the Fed and her being at the Fed. She started the Fed she cut her eye teeth in the midst of a crisis, 2008, and it was her job to forecast in the heart of that crisis. So she is battle tested from a young age. Yep. When she went back to the Fed, she was in charge of household consumer surveys and figuring out why did people behave the way they behaved as they processed and anticipated economic news. She has since moved on to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And she is the person for whom the Sahm Index is named. And I was very excited when it first came. Was it about a year, 18 months ago, something like that?
Last May, yeah.
Last May, okay. And she developed the first real-time index of when we're in a recession, and that actually works. Is before Claudia came along, we were dating recessions typically a year to two after they actually took place. And well, from a historical perspective, that's useful to know. From a policy perspective, it's really good to know that it's happening in real time. The Sahm Index once again showed when the recession hit in real time this time around. I don't think it will be off by even a month this time around. And since then, she has been working with policymakers on both the fiscal and monetary responses to this crisis. And so I thought she would be especially useful to have join us this afternoon. So Claudia, thanks so much for taking out an hour of your time with us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to be here today. And as Richard said, I have a lot to say about what's happening in the economy right now. My training, straight from University of Michigan, PhD in economics, was to work on the staff's macro forecast, the Federal Reserve staff macro forecast. I did that for 10 years, including my first forecast was January of 2008, and I was an expert on consumer spending, so that was quite a first year. And I spent a year at the Council of Economic Advisors, and my last 2 years I managed a research section in Consumer and Community Affairs, and that's where I was overseeing household surveys. So I have a mix of macro forecasting, macro policy work, and also a focus on households, and particularly thinking about marginalized groups and the fragility that many households are always live with and makes them fundamentally unprepared for a recession. So Claudia,
let me go ahead. One housekeeping item that I should have mentioned. If you have questions for Claudia, please type them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and then I will try to get to as many of them as possible at the Q&A part. So sorry for that.
Yeah, no, this is good. And I was going to say, I have slides that we'll share afterwards, but so I have remarks that should take about a half an hour. And then I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, because I want to learn from you all too. And you learn a lot about people from the questions they ask. So I'm excited about that part of the talk. The first piece, I'm going to I have three things that I want to share with all of you. First are perspectives on what is happening right now in the economy in terms of the severe recession that is underway. So I think that's important, and I have some facts to share on that, including the Sahm rule, what's happening with unemployment. And secondly, I want to talk for a little bit about what a recovery, or as I've come to talk about it, what disaster relief would look like on the disaster cleanup looks like on the other side of this. And then finally, I wanted to end talking about the policies that have come out of DC up to this point, both thinking about what Congress is doing and what Congress needs to do, and what the Federal Reserve has done and what they need to do. So that's the three things that I want to cover. Like I said, we'll get to Q&A. If there's anything I go along and it's a clarifying question, I'm happy, put that in Q&A and Richard can interrupt me as needed, because there's no sense in me wandering off and you all not being on the same page. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to start with where we're at right now. So this will be the most grim part of this presentation. So if we think about the jobless claims that we have seen since the beginning of March, and they are in the millions of claims, by my estimate, the unemployment rate as of over a week ago is currently over 20%. Okay, so 1 in 5 people who want to work, who were working in February, right, were in the labor force. No, of the people who were in the labor force who wanted to work in February, 1 in 5 of them do not have a job today. Okay, they are not getting a paycheck from an employer. That's just, it is absolutely unprecedented and heartbreaking, and actually hard to wrap one's head around that is what is going on in the country. And yet, every single one of us knows someone who has lost their job in the last 2 months, right? So this is real. This, in some ways, by where we got, this is a public health crisis first and foremost. The coronavirus is the source of all the misery that we are living through right now. Given where we were when the coronavirus arrived here and began to spread, a medically induced coma for the economy was the way to protect people. That was what policymakers decided. There's a lot of good reasons behind that. I'm not going to be the speaker to debate like what was the right public health response, but once that decision was made, once policymakers said we are closing down the US economy, this was a given, okay, that this was going to happen. Very early on, once I saw Italy shut down, I was like, oh wow, we are in for it. We are a lot more like Italy than South Korea. And once you shut an economy down, you are going to have a massive amount of disruption and activity. And that's what we've seen. Okay, so the world is moving so quickly that the official statistics, an important one being the unemployment rate, that are some of the best, most quick numbers we get, can't keep up. Okay, so we are going to get, so that was the case with the March unemployment rate. It's measured in the middle of the month. The middle of the month was just in March, was just when the economy was shut down. So there's just no way that a survey that went out then could really capture everything that happened by the end of March. When we get the April readings from the Bureau of Labor Statistics next Friday at 8:30 a.m., that is going to be a very sad moment, because we are, in my opinion, going to see numbers over 20%. There's some measurement issues. It's definitely going to be over 10. That means that we will have hit what was the peak in the Great Recession in a matter of weeks. I mean, this is just like, wow. Now, so that's the dismal part of this. And that's just where we are. This is not even about like where we could go, in terms of any more depth. So, okay, so we're putting to one side the fact that we have these massive job losses. Job loss is what makes a recession so horrible. It's why we fight back. We need to get people back to work. For many people, work is part of their identity, in addition to it's the way they make ends meet. Right, so this caused an enormous amount of strain. As I said before, many families in the United States do not have a financial buffer. They don't have a lot of money sitting around that they can access. So the survey that I worked on, the survey of household economics and decision making, it has a question that has gotten a lot of prominence since it began in 2013, where they ask households, what would you do if you faced a $400 emergency expense? Okay, and what we have found in this was in 2018, so years into an expansion, 4 in 10 adults said that they would use some kind of credit, borrow from family, sell something, or they simply could not pay. Okay, so that is just astounding. And my colleagues then who worked on the survey of consumer finances went into actual balance sheet data, and a quarter of households in 2016 did not have $400 in money they could easily get a hold of. Like, that's just, it's incomprehensible. And yet that tells us, I mean, that's just a reality, and that's been the case for a very long time in the United States, and that means we are never prepared for a recession. And this one, my goodness, like, there's no one could possibly be prepared for what's happened in the economy. So this is a very serious situation that we're in. To get a sense of, and the numbers are really hard to wrap your head around. So in the United States, we have a $20 trillion economy. $15 trillion of that is consumer spending. Okay, so when we shut down the economy, when commerce stops, and then when families don't have paychecks, that is an enormous amount of money that's just not going to get spent. It's not output. So I mean, services are they're about $10 trillion. There's a lot of services that we don't need right now because we can't leave our homes, and some services that aren't going to be safe for a long time, like transportation, entertainment. So this is a huge disruption to the US economy, and it's a huge disruption to families and small businesses and communities. Like, this touches everyone. No institution could be prepared for this. Okay, so switching from like where we are and kind of this, like, what the recession, what this free fall looks like, let's think about where we go from here when the economy reopens, and we're going to see this slowly and across the country in different ways. So what is this? So early on, before the shutdown, or like in the first week or so when it was coming, there was discussion from some macroeconomists, people who watch the markets, and they said this will be a V-shaped recovery. So that means that, we shut down the economy. Everybody understood as soon as we shut it down, it's just like straight down, right? Like, people spending stops. But they said, once we reopen the economy, like, we're just doing this to fight the virus. The economy was great in February, and it really was. 3.5% unemployment. We haven't seen that in 50 plus years, right? So we really were in a good place in February. So the idea was, well, we shut it down, we beat this virus, we open it back up in a couple weeks, and bam, everybody goes back to work, and we're all great. Okay, I mean, I was skeptical of this at the time, but as soon as you had a closure that wasn't 2 weeks, it was 2 months, and you got unemployment up to 20%, we are not going to see a rapid bounce back. The way that but we will, like, the economy will recover. Americans are scrappy. Like, we'll get to the other side of this. But the idea, like, Secretary Mnuchin was talking early this week, I believe, and said by the third quarter, we're going to be back. We're going to be back to where we were. We'll be recovered. And frankly, I would love for him to be right about that. I frankly see very slim chances of that because we were closed down for 2 months. All these people lost their jobs. Small businesses have closed. Small businesses that would have started haven't started. Like, if there are no jobs to go back to, then it's very hard to get things back on track quickly. So what I have likened this to, because again, we've never seen a recession quite like this, okay? So what I see as a good comparison is to think about this coronavirus recession as a Category 5 hurricane that the entire country was in the eye of the storm for 2 months, okay? So I've done research with colleagues at the Federal Reserve Board, and we built a database of spending indexes at restaurants and retailers that had very fine geographic detail, and it was daily data. And we get it like in 3 days. So we use that to study in real time Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma for the Federal Open Market Committee, because both of those hit right before and right around their September meeting. And what we saw there, and this was really like, we'd never been able to actually like, zoom in on a particular geographic, I mean, hurricanes are they're fast moving and they're very specific to a geography where the hurricane actually moves through. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that in the days of when the hurricane hits, you have a very sharp decline in activity. In the case of Irma, it really, retail spending in Florida almost went to zero in the days right around the landfall. But then it bounces, then it moves back to normal. It moves back to the level in a few weeks where it would have been if the hurricane had never happened. You don't see a recovery. Like in that short period, we don't see all this like spending that should have happened or would have happened when the hurricane was right on top of us, just all of a sudden like, jump back. And this kind of makes sense. If you're going to go out to dinner and then the hurricane came, like 2 weeks later, you're not going to go out to dinner twice, like make up for the dinner you lost on that Saturday, or at least not a lot of people would. So when I look at this research, and then like I said, I superimpose what we're living as like it hits the entire country and it lasts, then like this is really big. And when I think about the dynamics, what's going to happen after the economy starts to recover and after people start going back to work and having paychecks, it's going to take time, right? It's going to take a lot longer to recover than this period of 2 months that we've been in. So, but we do recover. It's just there's an incredible amount of damage that's going to have to be cleaned up after this recession like starts to turn into what we would think of as a recovery. Okay, let's see. So that's the picture of the economic conditions. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I have like endless amounts of things to say about what's happening in the economy. I want to turn in the last 10 minutes and just give you an overview of what's happening in DC, and particularly on how Congress and the Federal Reserve are trying to provide relief to individuals out in the economy, how they're trying to stabilize the economy, stabilize financial markets. So these, when you look at this slide, this is like the timeline, and I probably have made some errors, but it's absolutely amazing how much has been done and how quickly. So just starting with Congress, so they're up to like the fourth set of legislation that they put out. So they started, March 6th was the first, and it was an $8.3 billion piece of legislation. And it was entirely focused on public health, right? So issues that were very specific to the coronavirus attacking us. $8.3 billion, so that's in a $20 trillion economy. That's not a lot, but they got started, right? So that's March 6th. On March 18th, there was another $100 billion, and that started to go into like free testing for the uninsured, food stamps, paid sick leave, 2 weeks of it. So that's starting to get into this space of, we still have this public health crisis. Our first pass at it wasn't enough money to really address the coronavirus, the health piece of it. And there are clearly there are people who are really hard hit because they get sick or their family member gets sick. They don't have money to go get tested. The last thing we would want is people that don't have money to get medical care not getting tested, and then they have the virus and they're out in the community, right? So Congress was onto this, right? So that was the week later, the March 18th. And then March 27th was when Congress passed the $2.2 trillion relief package, so the CARES Act. And this big. Like, I did not sleep until this thing passed, like the 2 weeks where it went from being talked about to actually making it through the Senate. And it like passed in the middle of the night. And then I was like, I can go to sleep now. And it had, well, to me, that piece of legislation is where I can see that Congress learned lessons from the Great Recession. So a key lesson from the Great Recession, and this was true for Congress and it was true from the Federal Reserve, is that you have to go big and you have to go fast. Okay, so whatever you think is too much, like double it, right? So this is just, and they in 2008 and 2009, both Congress and the Federal Reserve did not do enough, right? And that meant that there was a severe recession, they could have made it less severe. And frankly, anything you do at the front end can help on the other end of the recession. It can kind of like pad the runway or foam the runway. So that was big, and there were a lot of pieces to the relief package. So I worked tirelessly on getting the rebates put together. This is in the research where I developed the Sahm rule. I have a proposal that you should do direct payments to people, get money to people, make it real. So that the rebates ended up being $1,200 per adult and $600 for dependent children. And that ended up being almost $300 billion. That's almost 3 times the 2008 tax rebate. So that's just one example of a lesson learned, go big. And that's a program that has been administered 2001, 2008. That money, more than half of that money is already in people's bank accounts. And the eligibility is much wider. Basically, you need a social security number. And if you have that, you have a claim on these benefits. So that's great. And then there were some creative, and then they did enhancements to jobless benefits, unemployment insurance benefits. They expanded who's eligible. They added $600 a week to the payment. So they did things, and a lot of these are temporary. It's like the pandemic, unemployment assistance. Those will taper off once the economy reopens. And then they did some really creative things like the payroll protection program that was to get loans that could convert to grants to small businesses. That has been an absolute disaster in its administrative rollout, but it was so well intended. And I mean, jumping a little bit ahead, on April 23rd, Congress approved another, hundreds of billions of dollars into that program. So Congress is doing the right thing, getting it out the door, getting the money actually to people and families and small businesses is really difficult, but they're trying, right? And all of this moved so fast, right, for Congress, which has been a learning experience for me. I've worked at the Fed. The Fed kind of like push a button and it happens the next day. But for Congress, especially given the difficulties in Congress of getting both sides of the aisle together, this is really impressive, as it should be. In a recession, you ought to put down all the politics and go to work because you're there to help people, and they're trying. It's going to make a really bad situation a little less really bad, but everything we do now, like I said, can help in the rest of this year and the next few years. Okay, so what does Congress need to do? They absolutely need to pass more direct aid to states and local governments. This is a massive budget crisis that is brewing, and this happened to a lesser degree in 2008, and we saw school teachers lose their job, we saw essential services cut, and that frankly, that's a wound that had not even healed until very late in the recovery from the Great Recession. So let municipalities go bankrupt is an absolute, it's like absolutely wrong, right? We can't have that happen all across the country. And one thing that I've been working on a lot recently is Congress has got to commit to continue the relief until people are back on their feet. This is going to get very expensive. We are going to blow through debt to GDP ratios of 2. People are going to get antsy. So commit now that you're going to stay the course, because they stepped away in 2008, and that again had disastrous consequences. Okay, so I guess kind of on a happy note, we'll talk about the Fed. So this is where I'll end. Now, for the Fed, and this actually took a little bit of work to put this together, I actually have 2 whole slides. I have the slide of what the Fed did in March and the slide of what the Fed did in April. In addition, as with Congress, they learned that you have to go big, and they went really fast on March 12th with injecting $1.5 trillion into the Treasury market. Okay, so like day one, they did a lot, right? I mean, day one of their actions. There was discussion at that point. So again, this is like March 12th, like we're only getting to the place where March 11th was the president's press conference in the Oval Office. We're, starting to think about shutting down the economy, but it's clear like where this is headed, right? So they did a big move. About that time, or after they did it, there was discussion from some market commentators, because the Fed, like their interest rates were still above 0, like they had some downward movement earlier in the year. And so the question was, should the Fed go to 0, right? And there were people who said, no, the Fed should save its ammo, hold off. And I mean, frankly, when I saw the one op-ed, I almost threw my phone down and broke it, because ammo is here to be used in a moment like this, right? And so the Fed knew that. This was part of the lesson. You go big and you go fast, right? So on a Sunday night, I mean, these weekends have been amazing. They're in March. On March 15th, the Fed cut rates to zero. They put $500 billion in the Treasury market, or they said they buy $500 billion Treasuries. They buy $300 billion in mortgage-backed securities. And so that was just they went big, they went wide. The Fed is its primary function. The reason it exists is the Fed is the lender of last resort, right? And what started happening in March is that you had dysfunction in many different financial markets. I mean, a lot of people were watching the stock market move, and on March 11th, it went into bear territory, so it was down 20%. And yes, that's very, everyone sees that. That's a very easy to comprehend number, but when people would ask me about this, stocks will come back. They'll recover. But oh my gosh, if these financial markets, if the Treasury market, the mutual fund market, if these stop functioning, we are in, this is really, really serious. The Fed obviously knows this is really serious. And so they kept trying to inject money into markets as the markets were getting destabilized. Then you went into, they launched a commercial paper lending facility on March 17th. That's actually when Treasury gave them the emergency 13.3 powers. On March 19th, they launched a money market mutual fund lending facility. That was one where it looked like maybe we're going to break the buck again. Not a good thing. And they, were buying Treasuries faster. They did, and then towards the end of on the last day of the March, they opened up a lending facility for foreign banks. Okay, so that just gives you a scope of how many markets were in deep trouble. And the Fed is just we are the lender of last resort. We are going to prop this all up in emergency, temporarily, because if not, the wheels are going to stop spinning and maybe fall off the bus. Okay, so then, but these were all programs. What they did in March is they basically blew through the entire playbook that they used in the Great Recession, financial crisis, and the years after. Okay, so they just pulled out all the stops. The balance sheet just exploded at the Fed. So they just compressed it. In April is when the Fed started moving into territory that they had not been in, where they didn't go in 2008. So everything they did in March, you're stabilizing financial markets. This is directly supporting Wall Street, quote unquote. Okay, it indirect, obviously if financial markets stop, it has bad effects for everybody, regardless if you're active in these markets. What they did in April is they took a step to very directly support Main Street. Okay, so on April 9th, they launched a Main Street lending program, which was specifically for middle-sized banks that were kind of they were outside of the payroll protection program because they were too big, but they couldn't access the corporate buyouts and the big corporate debt support. So that was really important. That's $600 billion of lending committed. And they also launched the municipal bond lending facility, and that was $500 billion. So I had an opinion piece in the New York Times last week talking specifically about the municipal bond lending facilities. I could say more about that, but the big thing for me is these are two efforts where they went directly to Main Street. And they're the Fed is here, we are going to help you. That's big, because I didn't see them do that in 2008 and in the recovery, and it was heartbreaking. But they're doing it now. They learned. Yay, we can learn. So what does the Fed need to do now? These new facilities, the ones that they moved into in April, they've got to really think hard about how to make them better. The municipal bond lending facility is very restricted in what municipalities can access it. And frankly, they don't need loans. They just need money, right? So the Congress needs to do this.
Speak a little more to so clarification is you write very well about this, but explain who gets access and who doesn't to this facility.
Right, so the municipal bond lending facility, as the Fed rolled it out, is any state can have access and do lending. The loans are 2-year loans, so they're in the short-term municipal bond market and not the long-term. And these are ways that the short-term markets are just how municipalities smooth through, say, tax revenues come in a big rush, but like you need to spend money in January, right? So that's what the short-term market is. The Fed is going to go into that. Any state can access it, any county with over 2 million residents, and any city with over 1 million. Okay, that cutoff of 1 million, that's like, I don't know, 15 cities. I mean, it's a really, and it misses a lot of hot spots. So New Orleans and Detroit and, you know, the Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that had the Smithfield packing plant, like places that have been an incredible disruption, have had like their expenses skyrocket in terms of public health. I mean, everybody's had their revenues fall through the floor, but these are really distressed areas, and they just like, there's nothing here for them. Right, because they can't access this facility. Now the Fed has already started talking about expanding it, you know, expand it to more municipalities, but that means you're gonna need more money. And again, it's risky, both in the business, the middle-sized business lending and the municipal lending, like you gotta pay the loans back. And it's actually not clear, so it's a risk. Anyways, but it's a step in the right direction. And I guess the last thing I'd say the Fed needs to do is do whatever it takes. And I think everything they've done so far shows that they will, and they'll continue to be creative. It's just, if Congress doesn't step up, some of the things that it will take the Fed to do are really pushing what we should ask the Fed to do. And the thing that I consider the nuclear option that I'm very concerned that we're headed towards is what's called money finance fiscal policy, lovingly referred to as helicopter money, where the Fed basically, you lend out money, but you say you're never gonna have to repay it. You take it on the Fed's balance sheet. You say you're gonna keep it forever. That's called monetizing the debt. It's essentially the Fed prints money and just pushes it out, and you never give it back. I mean, this would require congressional authority. This has never been done in any kind of country that wasn't highly dysfunctional, and it requires an immense amount of coordination between the Federal Reserve, Congress, and the administration, and that has basically never turned out well outside of wartime, but we're kind of at war with this virus. So I think there's a whole bunch of things the Fed can do in between this money finance fiscal policy and where they are right now. It's just they're in a very tenuous space. Like the Fed has dipped its toe in the water, and they have to jump in. And if they don't succeed, they're at threat of losing the Fed, right? So at this point, they got to make it work. And I think they'll try, but this is a really bad situation. Okay, so that was what I wanted to kind of say, you know, big picture. And I think now, hopefully we can open it up to questions. And I really do want to hear your questions, and anything you're thinking of, I'm sure someone else is thinking of. So like, please, you know, just jump in. I appreciate it.
Well, we have 22 questions.
Okay, all right. Well.
And so what I am going to attempt to do, and my apologies if anyone feels that their question is misconstrued by me, but then get mad at me for doing it. Some of them have similar themes, so I'm going to combine some so that I want to get through as much of the substance of the questions asked as possible in the next 25 minutes. So again, let's see how I do, and my apologies if I don't do this right, but I'll do my best. I just want to start with just clarifying, there are a couple of questions about context to where, sort of getting a sense of where we are. So from an unemployment, so two-part, unemployment standpoint, where do we stand now relative to the Great Depression? And then the second part is somebody asks, the study that shows that 1/4 of people couldn't get their hands on $400 if they had to without some difficulty. What was the unemployment rate when that survey was done?
Yeah, okay, so first, the Great Depression, and remember, our official statistics on the unemployment rate start in 1948. Okay, so we do not have comparable measures, like what we can see, what we'll get next Friday on April, we can't really compare that to the depths of the Great Recession. However, I mean, there's historical data and analyses. The way the Great Depression is normally described is the unemployment rate gets to 30% and you have deflation. So you have prices falling. maybe just so that I can get up out of bed in the morning, I have not like mentally put 30% as my most likely forecast of where we're going. I am, yeah, I'm concerned, and I think it's getting more and more likely all the time. But the Great Recession, in addition to getting 30%, was extremely protracted in its recovery, and policymakers made mistakes left and right. Okay, so even if we peak at 30%, I don't think that's where we're going to stay. I don't think we have the same. I don't think the moving past this looks like the Great Depression. I sure hope not. But it is an incredible amount of damage. And we've already seen, like, one of the, the photographs that we always see of the Great Depression is like the food lines, people just standing, and if you see, I've seen so many of these aerial photos of people queued up to get their, at the food banks, right? So in some sense, we're living some of those aspects that were so heart-wrenching in the Great Depression. So that could happen. We are already at twice the peak of the Great Recession in terms of unemployment. So this is just massive. The aspect of the deflation, so I think that's highly likely too. We're already seeing quite a bit of softening in the consumer prices. I don't know. I was talking with a macroeconomist friend about how to think about this. Do we want people to get their wages cut, or how, what are the dynamics? And there's been a lot of thinking about this, what happened in the Great Depression and other recessions since. And I was like, I have no idea what's happening but it's clear that economic relationships that we have understood or thought we understood for decades, if not over 100 years, they're all breaking down, right? So I don't even know, like I said, we got to pick the best of the worst scenarios and hope for that. So we'll just see what's going to happen. But yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. And I think that's, the Great Depression stands out as the worst moment in kind of modern U.S. economic history, and we're going to remember this like that. To the second point, so with the $400, so when that survey came out in 2013, and that was still relatively early in the recovery, so unemployment rates were elevated. I'm not going to pull it off the top of my head. And at that point, 50% said they would. Now, this is not the same as 50% don't have $400, okay? Because some people, you want to leave some money in the bank, so if you can put it on your credit card, you'll put it there. Now, that is showing us that there's some problems here, right? You ought to just be able to, swipe the card and $400 comes out of your bank account, right? Because that's a very thin buffer. So the fact that people are kind of hustling around and taking on debt for that small of an amount, it tells you that when they lose a paycheck, or a month's of they have some serious problems, because you start even bumping into what you could reasonably borrow. Now, what I had shared was the 40% statistic. That was in 2018. In 2018, we were below 4% unemployment, right? Things were good. And so, yeah, and things are not good right now. So I think that I use that statistic, and I brought it up now, not because I think that really anchors on exactly what households are trying to do right now to make ends meet. I bring that statistic up because in the United States, many families, and it's been true for decades and decades, have a very thin financial buffer. Again, Americans are scrappy. They figure out how to make things meet. They work an extra side job. They, cut back. They move around on credit cards. People have been able to live with these these small buffers for a long time, but it's hard and it's exhausting. And right now, it's overwhelming, right? So they have to have relief. And the other aspect that comes into play with this, households don't have the money in their bank account, and our social safety net in the United States is threadbare. And right now it's breaking because it was not prepared for the kind of jobless claims and food stamps. And so I think I just use that to just underscore one data point, and there's tons of them, that there's a lot of families that just can't deal with every day under 4% unemployment, and they can't deal with now. So.
So there's a series of questions that, again, I'm going to try to combine into one. And I think I know, given your last answer, I think I can predict how you're going to answer it. But do you worry about when we come out of this having an inflationary episode, how do we ultimately pay this back? How does the Fed unwind this? And one person specifically asked, do you believe in modern monetary theory? So I'm going to just put all of those questions together into thematically one.
Okay, I think the most important thing to understand right now is that we should not be worried about the federal debt level, full stop. Okay, and I'm not just gonna like say this emphatic thing, but if you hear nothing else in this whole talk, do not worry about the debt to GDP ratio, and do not worry about it until the unemployment rate is back down under 5%. Okay, and the reason for this, in a recession, recessions are very bad. They are destructive in the moment. They are destructive for years afterwards. Those of you, and I'm sorry to say this, that come out in the job market in the next year, you can like the hit to your career for years, and in some cases they're workers, there's good research that shows you basically are off the mark your entire career if you get a start in a bad economic in a recession. And so like you absolutely have to fight back. We have to make this as like less severe as we can. We have to make the recovery as like strong as it can be, as inclusive. Like it's got to support everybody, not just like those who have the most means. The federal government is the entity that can push money out. Like this, the fiscal policy, the direct aid, you know, the rebates, the money that they send to state and local governments, the money they give in bailouts to corporations, like the Congress is the place that can do this. Everybody else in the economy, we'll set the Fed aside for a minute. Everybody else in the economy, families, businesses, state and local governments, they all have to balance their budgets, right? Money in has to match money out. If they start taking on a lot of debt relative to their income, then we should be worried, right? Because you shouldn't take debt on, you shouldn't get debt that you can't pay back. The federal government in the United States, they don't need to pay this back. I mean, so and there's a few reasons for that. The United States is in a very fortunate position for a time of crisis, a time of recession, because US Treasuries are the safest asset on the globe. In a time of recession, there is a huge flight to safety. I joked with a friend whether the 10-year Treasury rate was going to hit zero before the federal funds rate hit zero. I mean, it really looked like they were in a race there for a while. And it's just the Treasury rates have been at levels that like, wow. I mean, it's basically like free for the US government to borrow. And so that's like in the moment, there's all this demand for US Treasuries. And we've also seen over decades and decades, the Treasury rates have gone down. There's an excess demand for Treasuries. There's a lot of savings. Some of it came out of China as a savings glut, but we also have an aging global population. They have more savings, right? So I don't see any reason for us to expect Treasury rates to get like, you know, really high. And it's the debt service that is what makes a high debt load problematic. As long as interest rates stay low, it's okay. And if we do not fight this recession, if we do not do what it takes, well, I mean, frankly, we can put the US's position as the like asset to borrow at risk, right? Like it's not a given that they come and buy treasuries instead of going to the European Central Bank, right? So like, and it just, there's no reason. The more that Congress does now, the faster the economy will recover, the more tax revenues will come back, you know. So this conversation, and it's already starting, and it's going to be very, very bad for the economy if Congress pulls back already on relief, because they're not done fighting. So that's really important. I wouldn't call myself a modern monetary theory advocate. That approach to the world extends inside of recessions and expansions. I do think that in a recession, we should not be worried about government debt. I did have concerns with the large tax cuts that Trump did solidly inside of an expansion. I didn't feel like that was prudent policy. Now, if the debt were taken on for real, like we're going to do infrastructure spending, we're going to invest in people that we have put on the sidelines, then I could see the argument because it's helping long-term growth. I think if we take debt, it needs to be done for a good reason, and a recession is a good reason. And I am fully supportive and worked on research, this recession-ready volume, the Equitable Growth and Hamilton Project put out. Like every single one of those, we were trying to come up with policies to fight a recession that were the most effective, backed on research. Like if President Trump has talked about a payroll tax cut multiple times, I told some folks I would come protest at Congress if they passed a payroll tax cut. It is the absolute worst way to get money out to people, but I do think you should get money out to people, right? So it's not just like, spend money and not pay attention to what you're doing, but if you're doing it for the right reason and you're doing it and it needs to be done, then like get to it. I feel like there was one in the middle I missed. Does that cover it, or is there?
I think you did a really admirable job of covering a compound question as well. I actually, there's one I'm going to pick out specifically. Janet Lee asked, can you talk a bit about the global context? You were touching on this just a little bit, and how the U.S. and other economies will survive this global recession, and what are other central banks doing to sustain financial markets around the globe? And I want to add one more point to this. To how much does the trade war keep us from recovering as quickly as we otherwise might?
Yeah, so on the global recession, that's a really important piece of this crisis to focus on. It's so easy to be in the United States and just be very focused on what's happening around us. The coronavirus is everywhere. I mean, it's killing people across the globe. And countries have varying ability to deal with this, right? I said the US government, we're in an amazing position. People want to buy treasury bonds. There are a lot of countries that don't have that kind of resources. Gita Gopinath at the International Monetary Fund spring meeting, she had a remarks on the global economy, and I think I saw her on the Daily Show or something else, and she was noting they have an unprecedented number of countries, I think it was around 50, that have come to them for assistance. This is just, I mean, that shows, and how much these countries are in dire straits, right? And this is, so across the developed countries, the United States and Europe, Australia, other parts of Southeast Asia, there's been a very concerted effort. You see all central banks, you see all legislative bodies, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but broadly speaking, you see everybody going at this thing, both in the public health space and in the economic space. Different countries have different ways of responding. Germany has a very different way that it supports workers in a recession than the United States does. So you see variety in what's happening, but you do see those countries moving, and in a big way and in a concerted way. Now, the challenges, this is hitting the entire world, and the challenges, just like in the United States, the challenges are much harder for families that didn't have a lot going into this recession. There are a lot of developing countries, emerging market countries, that they don't have the health systems to deal with this. They don't have the safety nets to deal with this. And it just, the amount of human suffering that is happening and will happen is, again, hard to wrap one's head around. We have a very severe global recession underway. And I don't know, it's a dangerous situation. People need to eat. They need to have a roof over their heads. This is hopefully, once the virus is under control, which may be a while, that we can get to that place and then the healing can begin. But right now, you see a lot of problems all around the world, real serious suffering. Now, the segue from that to the trade aspect is, we have seen cases in history where very severe economic disruptions and world wars led to a real pulling back of trade and interconnectedness. Instead of having a global economy, instead of having multinational corporations, it was more or less each for their own. And that's what I would put in the worst case scenarios of this. And what we're seeing right now is still a lot of coordination. I mean, there's movement of people to protect everyone's health is restricted, but there's still a lot of coordination. And I think that's promising. And we do need each other. I think global trade wars going into this, I don't, like, at this point, like, I didn't think they were good. Well, there are some long-term benefits of making sure that we are on an even playing field with China. I think I can see arguments for that. I think the management of how that was done was extremely problematic and caused more uncertainty than it needed to. And frankly, it kind of got shoved to this. Of all like the problems in the world right now, like the trade war that was going on just feels like kind of rounding error or something. But it does show that the dangers are there, that the United States cuts itself off, right? Because it feels like there's more of a reason now, and they were kind of pushing that before. So again, I see that as a downside risk, not a likely, but it absolutely is something to keep an eye on.
So again, I'm going to try to combine a bunch of questions, and it sort of deals with the question of a new normal, and I'm going to send this in a particular direction. I think had you told anyone 90 days ago that Congress would pass by unanimous vote a bill equal to about 10% of annual GDP, they would have said that you're crazy. I think had you said that people would accept being told to stay at their houses, and polling shows about 70% are fine with what governments are doing right now and don't really want to rush back out again. I think people accepting that curtailment of liberty would have been unthinkable 90 days ago. And so the tangible upshot to this is we have had considerable increases in the generosity of unemployment benefits. It's short, but it's considerably more generous than before. We have had interruptions in sort of contractual arrangements, I'll say, in credit markets that we hadn't had before. And we had a one-time universal basic income shot to everybody. I'm referring to the $1,200 that individuals within fairly broad eligibility criteria met. Does this all stick with us for a while? Do we see things surviving as a result of this because of our reaction to the virus?
So I think a few things on this, and I love that we're going to end on an optimistic note. I think what we're seeing are the kinds of sacrifices that we last saw in this country during World War II. Right, so the planting of the victory gardens, going without. I mean, it's hard to be at home all day. Like, it's not, I feel blessed. I'm healthy. My kids are healthy, but it's really hard to do all this work, try and save the world with better economic policy, and get my fourth grader to actually do his homework, like for real, and not just tell me he did it. Right. So like, this is hard, and people are making sacrifices. The ones who are on the front lines of this crisis, who have to go to work, who have to be in the hospitals, like, they are making absolutely the biggest sacrifice. I mean, they really are our front lines, are, equivalent to the men and women that we sent over to Europe to make sure that we stayed a free country. So when that happens, and what I've seen is it's encouraging, and it's what we're going to do. It's what Americans do, is we rallied together and we said, well, this is what we're going to need to do, and we're going to do it. And we're going to get through this, and we're going to help each other to the extent we can. Now, people are under an incredible amount of stress. Stress does not bring out the best in anyone. So we have to get this, we have to get to a better place, and we got to get there soon, because it is a very dangerous situation for us to sit in for too long. But I do find that hopeful. I think another thing that has helped that we did not have in the Great Recession is that this crisis didn't start in the United States. Like, in January, we could see China shutting down. Now, it didn't help us that we had one of the least transparent countries in the world was where this virus really took hold. But we did we did see it. We saw it in January. We saw like Lunar New Year. Like we saw things happening in China where it's like, wow, this is serious. It's so serious that they're letting us know it's serious. We saw it move through Southeast Asia. We saw it move to Europe. We saw Italy shut down, right? And so the thing is, by the time it got to the United States, and it took us a little bit to like get on board with like, we need to actually shut it down. I mean, February is kind of a missed period of opportunity, but we knew this is like the real deal. It wasn't like, oh, there's a few cities and there's outbreaks in the United States. I think that was what that helped in galvanizing our resolve, is like we were all in this together, everyone around the world. This was a very serious threat. And it was clear that the countries who are ahead of us in this and were trying to deal with the threat, they were taking really drastic measures. And that, I believe that helped. And that advance, like this has moved so quickly, even just being a week or two ahead of us, like helped us learn what we need to do. And yet I really think it was, I mean, the spirit of Americans pulling together, and frankly, that's really the only choice we had was to try to do this and fall in line and protect each other. So, yeah.
One last question. We have 3 minutes. I'm going to ask one
Right.
last question, which again is a bit of a slightly gossipy question, which we'll go into. Since you're there, are people actually on the Hill getting along with each other a little better as they have to deal with this? Because when I was there, let's just say people on the Hill didn't always get along very well with each other. And then more seriously, along those lines, what they passed, how much worse do you think it would have been in the absence of what's been done so far?
What do you mean, in absence of what's been done? That last piece.
Let's say there were no PPP. Let's say there wasn't the increased generosity of unemployment benefits. How much worse do you think it would? I mean, so what you're talking about is
what is this actually doing? Yeah. So, yeah, well, I will say on like what's happening on the Hill, the degree of cooperation or the lack of cooperation, this is relatively hard for me to gauge. I'd been at the Federal Reserve for 12 years. I didn't come to Equitable Growth until last November. And one of the reasons I left is because I wanted to be able to do analysis and support efforts on the Hill. Like, and I was thinking about preparing for the next recession, making automatic stabilizers. And so I really had not had a lot of interaction with the Hill. I'm not a political person at heart. So DC is actually a little bit hard for me to like handle, but inside of the Federal Reserve, especially the junior staff level, you're kind of protected and independent. So this has been a real awakening for me into how politics work. And yet once again, I'm brand new on a job in a crisis that is unprecedented. And so I think what I'm seeing, though it feels to me like so much tension and going so slow, is actually Congress holding hands and working together, right? Because they did get, like with the $2.2 trillion relief package, where it started, even 2 weeks before, I was like, oh my gosh. And then they were arguing and they wouldn't talk. But in 2 weeks, they passed the package and it was really good, right? So I think there is a degree of speed and cooperation that we don't see outside of moments like this. And frankly, I think they're doing better than they did in 2008, 2009, right? I mean, these are unanimously passing pieces of legislation, so that's good. In terms of whether it works, this is the really hard thing about the macroeconomy. We don't ever get to see the world without the coronavirus. We don't ever get to see the world without the $2.2 trillion package. So we'll never know how destructive the coronavirus was. We'll never know how effective the relief packages were. And yet, that amount of money is supporting people, right? And families and businesses. And it goes so broad, and they're real dollars. Like, this has got to help. There's absolutely no way. Again, we have a $20 trillion economy. There is no relief package that is going to come from Congress and the Federal Reserve that will plug this hole, right? Like, we have a recession. It's a severe recession. I think the most important thing they're doing right now is helping us have the recovery on the other side be as good as it possibly can be. That's still not going to make a lot of people happy because it's still going to be really rough, but it'd be so much worse if they weren't acting. So.
So, Claudia Sahm, thank you very much for sharing an hour with us. That was an information and action-packed 60 minutes. Thank you for all the great questions. And I know, again, I did my best to try to summarize them into, I know I still missed some of you. That is not a reflection on you. It's a reflection on the time we had. Our next program is going to be this Wednesday, 10 a.m. And the topic is management in a crisis. It's a very different sort of topic. And we hope to see you there at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. So all of you, thank you very much for joining us. And again, Claudia, thank you very much for sharing with us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.